with Anjali Kamat. Anjali?
We turn now to Kashmir, where tensions are running high. Since June, Indian troops and police have killed 15 people, sparking protests across Kashmir. The Indian government has imposed a strict military curfew in the area, as well as a media gag order on local journalists. The international community has remained silent on the human rights abuses in Kashmir. On Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton addressed the issue at a press conference in the Pakistani capital of Islamabad. She rejected Pakistan's request to mediate in the Kashmir conflict, calling it an impediment to Indian-Pakistani relations that the United States cannot solve.
For more, we're joined here in New York by the Kashmiri journalist and author Basharat Peer. His memoir of growing up in Kashmir is called Curfewed Night, a frontline memoir of life, love, and war in Kashmir. He's currently a fellow at the Open Society and student recently returned from a trip to Kashmir. Welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what's happened in the last month.
Thank you for having me here. It's been a series of protests which started with, I mean, the cycle goes back, but the recent protests of like thousands of people coming out on streets were triggered after a young high school student was shot by the Indian paramilitary forces who were deployed there to control the Indian-controlled part of Kashmir. There are around 500,000 Indian soldiers and paramilitary troops deployed in the Kashmir region to keep it under control.
Could you step back for a minute and just, for people who are not familiar with this conflict, even saying Indian-controlled Kashmir, give us the map of this area?
So Kashmir region is divided in two parts. One is controlled by India and other is controlled by Pakistan. This happened soon after India and Pakistan became independent countries and fought their first war over Kashmir, where the UN got them to agree on a ceasefire, and the ceasefire line that divides the old Kashmir state into two parts is called the line of control. And the current troubles are in the Indian-controlled part of Kashmir, where the main capital, where the main city is Srinagar, and that's where what has been the hub of these protests and the civilian deaths killings by soldiers.
Well, how many people have died in the past few months?
In the past month, by now, it's 17. Just 2 days back, a boy who was chased, a protester who was chased by the police, sort of drowned in a river, and then his body was carried out in this North Kashmir town called Baramulla, and there was a big funeral protest, and the police and paramilitary fired on the funeral, and one more person was killed, and around 20 people were injured. So it's gone up to 17, and the place is completely under a military lockdown.
What are people calling for?
The slogan on the streets, the demand is independence, and that has been the old Kashmiri demand. And but the more that's sort of the long-term political desire, but the more urgent demand is something that can be done, that India can do in a day, is to repeal these two very unpopular laws. One is called the Disturbed Areas Act, and another is called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. These laws essentially give complete legal immunity to any Indian paramilitary trooper or a soldier deployed in counterinsurgency in Kashmir. Like, if they suspect any person of being a threat, they can shoot and kill, and they cannot be tried in a civil court of law, even if the person turns out to be an 8th grade student, which happened recently when I was in Kashmir, and there was an 8th grade student who was killed when the police fired, and then there were protests, and 2 days later there was a high school student who was killed, and I met his father, and he was fighting the case in the courts. In one of the rare moments that the paramilitary officer had been arrested, but they couldn't really fight the case properly, because to waive the immunity that soldiers have in Kashmir, India's Home Ministry needs to, and Defense Ministry need to give permission to the local government to prosecute these people. And there are 458 cases so far in which families and courts in Kashmir are still waiting that permission from higher authorities in India to prosecute soldiers known to have killed civilians. And the permission has been denied in all cases. So it is crucial that this law, and it has even been recommended by a committee formed by India's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, that in 2006, which recommended that these laws should be scrapped as they abuse all civil rights.
Basharat, in your memoir, Curfewed Night, you talk about growing up in the shadow of militancy. Talk about how the landscape of protest has changed in Kashmir from militant groups to now this intifada-style uprising with young boys on the streets throwing stones.
See, Anjali, the big turn happened sort of in a post 9/11 world. The insurgency against Indian rule had been going on since 1990. But by then, there was a combination of two factors that by 2004, we saw the fighting waning, was that India had a huge counterinsurgency campaign, which was accompanied by widespread human rights abuse, but it was a military success. So most of the Kashmiri rebels were either killed or had laid down their arms. And Pakistan used to send in Islamist militants from across the border. But under Musharraf, they too cut back support to those groups. So the general level of violence had come down in Kashmir by 2004, 2005. And that was slightly opening space for people to live in a lesser degree of fear and to raise their voice. And then all the repression of this whole time since 1990 seemed to explode in 2008 when there was a land dispute with the government which triggered like major protests. Like hundreds and thousands of people were on the streets. It was the biggest protests calling for independence in Kashmir since 1990. And I think that was a big move which sort of had the shift from violent politics to non-violent politics. But unfortunately, those protests were like put down with the gun. Around 60 protesters were shot and around 600 people had bullet wounds. But after that, I think we didn't have as many peaceful protests, but youngsters who saw the peaceful protests being put down, picking up the stone and being inspired by various global examples of protests where, basically frustrated civilians have pushed for political demands using stone throwing, and that's been going on since 2008.
Bashar, what about the U.S. stance? I remember when President Obama was running for president, he said Kashmir is a key flashpoint that must be resolved between India and Pakistan.
President Obama did. It was after Kennedy, President Clinton briefly mentioned Kashmir, but it was after a long time that an American president, in all honesty, actually talked about Kashmir in a serious way. But he came and he appointed Ambassador Holbrooke as a special representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and his brief was, the talk was that it would also include Kashmir. But India is traditionally very resistant to any outside interference, and India lobbied very hard not to have Americans talk about Kashmir, and Americans did back off.
What do you think the U.S. should do now?
I think the U.S. should talk about the human rights situation in Kashmir as any civilized country should, and also encourage India and Pakistan to include Kashmiris in the talks and move forward in peace talks. U.S. can't, force a solution on the two countries, but I think it's important to raise the questions of having a whole population under a military lockdown and having laws on books which essentially give people license to kill.
We want to thank you for being with us. We're going to continue this conversation right after the broadcast, and people can go to our website at democracynow.org to hear the second part. Basharat Pir's book is called Curfewed Night, one Kashmiri journalist's frontline account of life, love, and war in his homeland. That does it for the show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Berkshire, for the producer, Armata Anjan Kamat, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Masood, Robbie Karen, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Nagira, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julia Crosby, Nick Gilla. We'll be broadcasting from the Netroots Conference in Las Vegas on Thursday and Friday. Again, our website is democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Kamat. Thanks so much for joining us.